and he was actually like 27-year-old ish, just Native American, who was actually pretty big dog. Ended up being connected with Mabel Dodge Luhan and in politics, and that Jung had said he's kind of almost not so much a nobody, but he had wonderful conversations with him. But
yeah, Jung thought he was a chief of the Pueblo Indians, and
yeah,
he wasn't that at all.
Mm-mm.
So it was, well, it was the son of one of Jung's earliest followers, somebody who did a lot of translation for Jung in the early days. That son was working in Berkeley by the time this trip took place. And so the son took Jung and then wrote this piece that corrected all the things that Jung said in the Memories, Dreams, Reflections. But I said to Jordan, well, it doesn't surprise me because Jung was so introverted that he probably didn't hear anything that was said. Right. So anyway, whatever. It made a good story in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And as my old mother used to say, it's my story and I'm sticking to it. And, if you don't like it, and if it's not true, it ought to be. That's what she would say.
It's funny. She and my dad would get along because he would always say, yeah, it's true the way it happened. It's just a lot more true the way I told it.
Good evening, Beth. It's nice to see you too. I don't want to ignore you. And
I'll forward it to you, Nick. Yeah, I think you'll get a kick out of it.
Okay, yeah.
So we have only 4 paragraphs here. And I will read the first one, I guess. Oh, let's see. Will I read the first one? I will. And then we'll pass it around. Okay, so we're talking, this is the second part of the problem of attitude type. And we're at paragraph 93 of the book, 2 essays on analytical psychology. And this is about values, and it's a very important topic, which I'll explain in a story I'll tell after the paragraph. If at this point we take up the thread we let fall earlier, we shall now see clearly why it is that the values which the individual lacks are to be found in the neurosis itself. At this point, too, we can return to the case of the young woman and apply the insight we have gained. Let us suppose that this patient is the analyzed, i.e., she has, through the treatment, come to understand that the nature of the unconscious thoughts lurking behind her symptoms, and has thus regained possession of the unconscious energy, which constituted the strength of those symptoms. The question then arises, what to do with the so-called disposable energy in accordance with the psychological type of the patient. It would be rational to transfer this energy to an object, to philanthropic work, for example, or some useful activity with exceptionally energetic natures that are not afraid of wearing themselves to the bone, if need be, or with people who delight in the toil and moil of such activities. This way is possible, but mostly it is impossible. For do not forget, the libido, as the psychic energy is technically called, already possesses its object unconsciously in the form of the young Italian or some equally real human substitute. In these circumstances, a sublimation is as impossible as it is desirable. because the real object generally offers the energy a much better gradient than do the most admirable ethical activities. Unfortunately, far too many of us talk about a man only as it would be desirable for him to be, never about the man as he really is. But the doctor has always to do with the real man, which remains obstinately himself until all sides of his reality are recognized. True education can only start from naked reality, not from a delusive ideal. Okay, anybody want to pick on that one?
Yeah, it's pretty strange that he says the libido, as this psychic energy is technically called, already possesses its object unconsciously in the form of the young Italian or some equally real human substitute.
Right. And so unconsciously, she had already allocated the libido there to this Italian man, presumably.
That is interesting, Nick. There's the kind of like when he says dream, your body experiences dreams physiologically as if they were real because they are real psychically. Mm-hmm. That then the libido simply having visualized that Italian or other man, it's already attained it since it's seen it, as it were, it would seem.
Yeah, I just think that's strange because it seems overly deterministic. And it's also strange because, the same criticism was launched against Freud, just that he engaged in kind of positivism, which is essentially just extroverted determinism.
Yeah.
Right.
Jung is just as much of a positivist as just introverted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
which, I mean, I suppose is just an expensive way of saying it seems like he's saying like, there's not really any kind of free will or anything possible here. There's no freedom of choice. Like everything's already worked out based on these interior dynamics.
Yeah, where was I reading that today? Anyway,
it's interesting. He goes on to say, in these circumstances, the sublimation is as impossible as it is desirable, because the real object generally offers the energy a much better gradient than do the most admirable ethical activities. It's there that he's supporting the libido's fantasy, and not to then, do-gooderism, put it into some kind of ethical activity.
Yeah, later on, he says that these issues are really unconscious, and you can set your cap to do something in particular with somebody, and you may not do anything. I think I might even have the book here open if I'm lucky. Oh, yes, that's right. Okay, so I'm looking at Liberating the Heart by Lawrence Jaffe. That's what I was reading this morning. And Lawrence has a little different take on it. He says, how psychic change really occurs. Most of us, psychotherapists or not, don't realize how profound psychological change comes about. We fancy that change comes about through active pursuit, through a conscious effort to change an attitude that has been judged faulty. When therapists and patients strive together in this mode, they may increase awareness, which is always valid, but the healing itself invariably occurs at a psychic depth hidden to the ego. In other words, the ego can't see what's going on in this unconscious depth. Moreover, it manifests in unexpected ways. For example, a spouse and a child of the patient begins to feel a little lighter, perhaps, whereas the attempt to change the faulty attitude directly often has little effect. Jung says that psychic change occurs through the operation of the transcendent function, homeostatic tendency in the unconscious that aims to balance out the one-sidedness of the conscious attitude. Because the ego is by definition one-sided, the compensatory function of the unconscious is constantly at work. The ego puts blinders on, so to speak, the better to focus on the matter at hand. A mature ego, the achievement of which is a major goal of psychotherapy, is more open to the corrective and balancing influence of the unconscious than the immature ego, which is rigidly identified with the conscious attitude.
It's curious to me how much I see a distinction here between, for example, talk therapy and brain spotting. Because in brain spotting, for example, you don't direct the excess energy. You get tingles in your body and it goes right back to where it's supposed to be. So you dose yourself with yourself, but it's not conscious or in any way willful. Whereas then he's almost imprisoning the idea to his complex of the fantasy object.
Yeah, so you keep mentioning brain spotting. What is the process for brain spotting?
The process is actually quite simple. The psychologist will hold like a telescoping stick with a small black ball on it, and they will move through the scene slowly, just in front of you, and you, with your eyes, slowly just follow it, and at some point you'll feel some kind of charge in your body, at which point you just raise your hand, and he or she will stop, and you literally just focus on that spot. And the theory is that at any point of trauma, your eyes were fixed right there, and it would burn on the back of the brain in that spot, the trauma. So then by then focusing on that and just allowing it with no words, the trauma character, called a part, capital P-A-R-T, will usually come forward. It's as if it opens the door, and that's the only place that trauma can come from, is because the theory is trauma is always fresh. It doesn't age. And so it could come through calmly or, stark raving mad like the Tasmanian devil, screaming and raging at you, but possibly because it's been incarcerated for however long since that trauma. And you just deeply listen. You don't respond. Allow it to subside like any storm. And then once it does, you simply say, do you have a message for me? And it's interesting. You'll get like 3 to 10 words that are really, really powerful. For example, one was, oh, I don't dissolve. Neither do you. And then I got this huge tingle in my lower abdomen. And it was from a surgery I had when I was a kid. And so it's interesting to me that sometimes you don't even have to ask. It will just tell you. But it's different than talk therapy, which ends up being kind of very in the head, trying to solve things by changing the behavior, which is to me almost like a gardener cutting off a weed off with scissors above the ground and saying, oh, look, the garden's so clean. And then 2 weeks later, that changed behavior, so to speak, comes right back. So it's not really resolving anything. It can, but it's so brain spotting to me is it's just more, it's less verbal and more visceral to deal directly with traumas, and oftentimes not even asking to look at a trauma. It's just the ones that are ready are ripe to come out when you find that spot and just gaze in on it. So that's in a nutshell. I think
so do you go through the whole spectrum of your of the area in front of you, or
you basically
you just
once
find one?
Well, you find one until it's resolved, and sometimes that's a whole session. hour and a half, and sometimes it's minutes. And once that's resolved, you kind of pause, and then you resume with the black bulb. You move through to see if you find another one. And sometimes you'll only get one. Sometimes you'll get none. And I mean, for example, my first 4 sessions, I had 0. But it was one of those, I kind of felt my mind was being a ninja. Like, it was skeptical in a way, even though I'm the one who started it. I was interested in it. But about the 5th session, it started consistently every time, 1, 2, or 3. And then they all started almost like crowding in, and I had to kind of call roll and go, hey guys, go back. You can roam around free, but come back, because right now I can only handle one of you at a time, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever hear about this, Marilyn, in your practice? Do you remember anybody talking about it?
There was a concept when I was, I've been retired for a long time, but there was a concept when I was learning called EMDR.
Right.
And it sounds very similar to EMDR.
EMDR is the more intense version. It'll rattle you more. And the psychologist and I talked about them both. And it's like, I didn't need to be hit over the head with a hammer kind of thing. So the brain spotting was no less intense, but it wasn't such a battery.
Well, it's newer than when I was in school and learning this. But what's coming up for me now is a lot of this has to do with denial, and where you're not willing to see the negative. And so if we could all see all the negatives that happened and deal with them, we would deal with the trauma as it happened, or we think about it. But sometimes it's so painful that, the trauma can be, as you said, I knew somebody who had a trauma as a 2-year-old boy. He was screaming in the hospital, and the nurses put him in a crib and put the crib in a dark room.
Mm-hmm.
And he was so terrified. So that became a trauma for him for the rest of his life, until when it came out, then you could see it. Well, I was a child, this is what happened. So I think if there is a trauma which you're describing, it has to be dealt with differently than if it's what I would deal with typically would be someone's neurosis.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, you're right with that. I noticed the denial pieces that would feed into my general structure that were assumptions. I mean, but I also then noticed I won't call it ignorance, but blind spots, where that tended to be where those neuroses were rooted. So that's why they're so hard to find, is that you may take what's out here, but it'll grow back. And so opening up with the brain spotting seemed to expose those blind spots by, I think, Jung, right, true education can only start from naked reality. So instead of all my judge and jury inside and what I will accept, and what's my fear, that's just environmental awareness, versus the anxiety part that makes me afraid. And there was the denial part, and then also there was just simply blind spot. There were simply blind spots too, where I just had no clue. And then wow, it was so obvious. And I think it kind of developed somewhat of an anti-hysterical bias in a way, where no matter what came up, I would address it. So it was, don't waste trouble. And in that, I found you make diamonds out of misfortune, but you're right. Sometimes with some people who don't have, basically they have a lot of anxiety, they get terrorized even by the therapy. I mean, it's harder for them because that even scares them, because in a sense they feel a fraud and you see right through them, and that's part of their neuroses. But it is. I'd say the lesser form of EMDR.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move on through the rest of this chapter. And I do have a topic that I want to raise at the end about values and neurosis, and which came up in this paragraph 93, but I don't want to divert our discussion until after. So, Nick, could you do paragraph 94?
Yep. Right. It is unhappily the case that no man can direct the so-called disposable energy at will. It follows its own gradient. Indeed, it had already found that gradient even before we set the energy free from the unserviceable form to which it was linked. For we discover that the patient's fantasies, previously occupied with the young Italian, have now transferred themselves to the doctor. It's reference to a footnote which states, Freud introduced the concept of transference as a designation for the projection of unconscious contents. The doctor has himself become the object of the unconscious libido. If the patient altogether refuses to recognize it, the fact of the transference, restart that sentence here. If the patient altogether refuses to recognize the fact of the transference, or if the doctor fails to understand it or interprets it falsely, vigorous resistance is supervened, directed towards making the relation with the doctor completely impossible. Then the patient goes away and looks for another doctor or for someone who understands. Or if he gives up the search, he gets stuck in the problem. It's reference to another rather lengthy footnote, which I'll read now on the topic of transference.
Okay.
Contrary to certain views, I am not of the opinion that the transference to the doctor is a regular phenomenon indispensable to the success of the treatment. Transference is projection, and projection is either there or not there, but it is not necessary. In no sense can it be made, for by definition it springs from unconscious motivations. The doctor may be a suitable object for the projections, or he may not. There is absolutely no saying that he will, in all circumstances, correspond to the natural gradient of the patient's libido, for it is quite on the cards that the libido is envisaging a much more important object for its projections. The absence of projections to the doctor may, in fact, considerably facilitate the treatment, because the real personal values can then come more clearly to the forefront.
Okay. My observation has been that there is transference in everyday life, in the sense that after my mother died, for example, it didn't take long, because we live close to Geneva. We live right next door to her. And she's my wife's mother. It didn't take long before I was kind of thinking of her as my mother. And my sense of it is that I had a transference to her of the energy that would be relevant to mother, just naturally. I mean, there wasn't any psychotherapy involved. And, now we're 12 years down the pike, and she's very close to me in a mother-son sort of way. Actually, she's closer to me than she is to her son, because he never pays any attention to her. But she transfers that libido of son over to me by that projection, and I transfer the mother's son, or the mother image, over to her. I don't know, anybody want to comment on that?
What's interesting to me,
it seems like each of those relationships that you're talking about are suitable objects for the so-called libido. So it makes
Right,
sense.
and I've transferred brotherly libido over to Tim Holmes. Tim and I are closer than friends, because we treat one another like brothers, I think. At least that's my sense of it. Because I lost my brother in 1988, so that was quite a while ago. But all of a sudden, Tim becomes, a friend of mine, and then that projection of the brotherly relationship gets cooking. The libido that's in it gets cooking.
The only question that I would have in that case or in other cases, I mean, such as the one you described with your mother-in-law, is if you're conscious of the fact that that projection is happening or the transference is happening, I think it kind of changes forms a little bit.
In what sense? Changes.
I don't
forms?
know that I necessarily have an answer. It just seems like if it's something that you're conscious of, it might not be the same kind of unconscious transference that's being talked about here in the book.
Yeah,
Well,
definitely. I
I'll
mean,
speak
definitely. Yeah, definitely. Geneva is not my mother. Okay, I recognize the difference between the two women.
I mean, not only that, of course that, but also that you're able to just talk about it and say, this seems to be what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, Jordan, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the most powerful forms of trauma is absence or neglect. The lack of attention is actually more disturbing. If you've seen the 2-minute video of the stone-faced parent with the little kid who just gets terrorized thinking his mom's dead right in front of her.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because you had the healthy libido energy place for mom and for your brother. And what's interesting, then you're then keeping that thing that was of value to you alive by literally transferring that energy, which is natural and that you felt resonant in your life, to then someone who's still here. So in a sense, you it's like move into a different house.
Yeah, but mind you, it's 30 years later in the case of my brother. In other words, that energy was in the unconscious. I never envisioned having a friend that was that I felt like he is my brother.
You cared so deeply for your brother. I mean, it felt like that your brother made such a wonderful place for then the powerful friendship with Tim in a similar role.
Right. That's my thought anyway. Thank you, Deanna. That's very kind of you. I have received a, what do you call it? A super chat on YouTube, which is very rare, but I appreciate it. And hello, everyone on YouTube. Justin is here, Penelope is here, Neil's here, and Deanna D is here, and Julie Mayer is here, and Justin,
and Raquel. Good to see you back.
And we have Raquel here in our group. Anybody want to comment on anything like what I've said?
I have a comment to make. Yeah.
Okay.
This is Marilyn. It's not in a therapeutic relationship. If you're the therapist, you want to encourage this because it can help in the work that you're doing. But what happens sometimes in real life is you have a relationship between two people and one has a transference that the other person doesn't have.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be very uncomfortable or freaky sometimes. Somebody falls in love with you or somebody thinks you're wonderful and you barely have any conscious awareness of them. So it's kind of like there's a one-way transference. So when you're doing therapy, you want to encourage the transference because eventually you can use it in the work. But in life, if this happens, it can be very disturbing.
Okay. So far I haven't experienced it being disturbing. I mean, I have many, typically I have one very strong male friend, who's in my current circle, but I have many of them planted around the planet now. and we still have good relationships. For example, I have one from 1962 that, he's my longest held friendship, and we nowadays we communicate nearly every day, and his wife communicates with me almost pretty much every day, because she's doing a project where she's searching for arcane words, mysterious words, and then putting them out on tweets, or not tweets, but on WhatsApp every day. And so when I receive, and she does this for a list, I don't know how big her list is, but maybe it's 10 or 20. But then almost every day I respond to her in some way about what she's saying about her arcane word. So, you know, they have become sort of born again dear friends, because I hadn't seen them for 30 years. Actually, I hadn't met Penny until, and this is not Penny Ryder, this is Penny Dorr. I hadn't met Penny for more than 40 years. And so, but, you know, they're dear friends. They live far away. They live on northern Vancouver Island. And so they live on the other side of the continent from me.
I'd be curious as to Marilyn's perspective. It seems to me that transference that you're consciously aware of is healthy, because it doesn't have the denial of the initial loss present in it. Does that resonate or land,
Yeah.
Marilyn?
No, it's not. It's not about loss, but someone will feel a relationship that the other person does not. It's not reciprocal. So that's why a woman might find this man is madly in love with her, and he's maybe putting mother on her or somebody else.
Oh,
And
okay.
she's not feeling it. She wants to get rid of him, and she
Right. Okay. No, that makes sense. Because then,
Yeah.
so Skip has reciprocal friendship, you know, with Tim. So there's
Right.
brother. So, okay, I see what you're
And,
saying.
you know,
That's a
and
better way. That's what Skip's way. It's better.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, and my relationship with Geneva is very strong, you know, where she's with us, you know, nearly every night. And we'll be traveling with her to Albany tomorrow. And so we're very close to her. You know, I'm not saying she's my mother, not by any means, but you know, I feel, you know, I feel that sort of role with her. I mean,
Almost like adoption, like almost like adoption or step parent in a way. I mean,
yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like that, right? I mean, one thing about Geneva is she's lived the perfect mother life. In other words, the perfect archetypal mother, and that's all she has done. She will be very happy if she gets out of life without making a single ripple. But she's, in terms of all the wickets that are involved in being mother, from first pregnancy to now, she's perfect in that respect. I mean, if I were to pick an archetypal mother, it would be her, because, you know, no discrepancies. Anyway, so
paragraph 95.
Yeah, 95. Who's got the? Okay, Jordan, you're it.
I'll take it. If, however, the transference to the doctor takes place and is accepted, a natural form is found which supplants the earlier one and at the same time provides the energy with an outlet relatively free from conflict. Hence, if the libido is allowed to run its natural course, it will find its own way to the destined object. Where this does not happen, it is always a question of willful defiance of the laws of nature or of some disturbing influence.
Yeah. So
And that resonates with what Marilyn said, the willful defiance of the laws of nature. That kind of brings up that denial piece that you mentioned, where the natural thing there is the denial. That's what you have to engage, not what you think it is. I mean, to get at it, it seems.
So, Marilyn, at one point I was looking for a Jungian analyst to be my analyst, because I know all Jungian analysts have an analyst. That's one of the rules of the game. And so I said, well, okay, maybe I can start to follow that rule a little bit, although I have no aspiration to become an analyst per se. But maybe I could find an analyst who would, collar me if I was getting out of line in any of my public things. I mean, I've been doing a website for 11 years now, and it has over 3,500 essays on it. And even this channel I've been doing for 6 years now. And so when I was looking for an analyst, I was always looking for a woman analyst. But what do you think about that? I mean, around here in Washington area, that's all you can pretty much get, as far as I understand. But go ahead.
Well, I think it depends on what the needs are of the individual. So when you're doing therapy, one of the first questions almost always is asked is, why are you here? And in my experience, people are almost always in therapy because their life is so out of control and they're so unhappy that they can't stand to live one more minute. They're just miserable. Mm-hmm. So that's very different from what I would expect that you're looking for.
Well, then what is it then for every Jungian analyst that has to have an analyst? Jung made a point of that.
Well, the reason I think it's very valid, because you have to know when and I would say it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. If it's a gifted person who's been working years and years, mm-hmm. I would think it's irrelevant. It might not be irrelevant, but to me it would be. I've had both kinds. Mm-hmm. When you're doing therapy with an individual, you want to be sure that you're dealing with their issues and not yours. Mm-hmm. And you're shaking your head, Jordan. Do you agree? Do you understand that?
Yeah, I do, because there's again the blind spot, the denial, where then you will be putting your stuff on them without realizing what you're doing.
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a very big mistake I made. I've studied family therapy, and what I did is I had the family do artwork on a blackboard, mm-hmm. and they drew a picture of their ideal way to spend a day together. They were having problems just being together. They didn't like each other. So they did a ski vacation, and they were all wearing skis, and they had a dog with them, and mm-hmm. It was wonderful. And then they did everything they could, words and pictures. And then on the top of it, I drew a thing about money. And so when I was finished and I spoke to my supervisor, they said, where did the money come from? I said, well, I just wrote it there. And she said, well, that's your issue. That has nothing. They were not concerned about money. You brought in your issue that didn't come from them.
Right.
And so maybe it was an issue for them. Maybe it wasn't. But why did you do that?
Yeah. Why did you say that? Right.
And who are you treating? Right. So if you're bringing in your own personal issues and you're not aware of it, you're not really treating the person. And it's an injury to them.
I also just want to add, Skip, I don't think that that's necessarily unique to Jungians, although it might be an explicit recommendation, but every therapist I know, Jungian or non-Jungian, has their own therapist, just because I think, mm-hmm. well,
Yeah,
Well,
I have no objections. I've just never been able to recruit one
Right.
because,
But also, I just wanted to say, to add to that, I think this has been my illusion. So I'm not necessarily saying this belongs to any one of us particularly, but I think it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that a therapist has their stuff together and they've already worked out all their problems and they're like the ideal human being and you're going to them to be fixed and all of that stuff when they're in the soup just as much as you are. So of course
Yeah.
you need somebody to talk to as well. Probably
Well,
more
it's
so than people who are in their
Yeah.
stuff.
of course, Jung would always say to a new patient, so you're in the soup too.
yeah,
Oh, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's one other thing that I just wanted to add quickly while I'm here. It's also really interesting, you know, I'm thinking about this concept of transference and what it might be like to be transferred to be on the receiving end of a transference as well, and
Mhm.
how difficult it must be to have to stand your ground against something like that. Or
Mhm.
stand your ground is probably too combative, but to know yourself well enough to not fall victim to all of the projections and all of the transference, you know, whether it be somebody thinking you're a horrible monster or constantly showering you with praise, or
Well, I think
one way or the other.
a common problem might be that, you know, women who would be your analyst and might tend to fall in love with you, and Samantha or Savannah might have something to say about that.
Well, no, and that's
I
people
don't know.
fall in love with
All
the
I'm
reader.
saying is I think that it takes an incredible amount of self knowledge, knowing oneself to apply the old
Mhm.
victim.
Yep.
And I also think it's interesting that, you know, of course, I'm not trying to turn this into a conversation about gender norms and stuff like that,
Mhm.
but I don't think it's primarily or even exclusively an issue of gender, because as he's saying, you know, there's this gradient that the that the libido chooses to express itself, and he's talking about this within the concept or within the context of type. So I think type would matter probably more so than gender or something. You know, if you were to try to go see somebody who's typologically dissonant with you, that would probably be more of a problem than whether the analyst was male or female.
Well,
Yeah,
and there's an
that
art
might
to
be.
it also, because I mean, people will fall in love with a teacher, a professor,
Yeah,
their
sure.
tarot professional. I mean, anyone who's in a position of dispensing any kind of information, wisdom, or advice
Yeah.
has to run not a fine line at all. I mean, I laugh that, you know, someone offered me sexual favors in exchange for the reading, and I simply, without even batting an eye, said, prostitution is not part of my business model. You know, but that it cut right through, and
Yeah.
you know, but it also, they got to laugh, and then they didn't feel shamed either,
Yeah.
because that's to me interesting there. I mean, for example, who reads the reader? Last year, as I started to expand my practice, I decided that I needed an astrologer once a month.
Mhm.
No more going it alone. And it's as much astrologer, another reader, divinatory professional, also coach, that then in a sense, I laugh, keeps me pointing in the right direction. So I don't have to always think about where am I going. I just need to do my work, you know. And so I think it's who reads the reader, who analyzes the analyst, and you know, the analyzer. It's an important piece. Also, I think, as Marilyn brought up, the reciprocality, because in doing so, you're both professionals. It's easier to call a professional in the same field out on something, and they understand that you're not shaming them, you're informing them.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I
Beth,
kind of have a question.
Okay, go ahead. Raquel, go ahead.
Can the libido get lost? Because we live in a reality where identity is very important, even social identities, gender identities, whatever. So I believe that identity itself comes through the ego, because it's the conscious part. So in that transference, can the energy itself get lost? Not just yourself, not just your conscious mind, or not just, whatever treatment that you're trying to go through,
Yeah.
but can
Well,
the energy just not know where it has to go?
I think that's assuredly true, and it's the punchline of Donald Kalshad's talk on at Pacifica, where he talked about trauma in the soul, and he ends it with the words are something like this: "And let us not forget the ancient rabbi who said." I've come to give you life and to give it in abundance. Okay, that's John 10:10. Of course, the ancient rabbi is Jesus Christ. And what he was actually doing was opening up channels of libido, I think, among his followers. And so, he says something like, he was the divine child standing in two worlds at the same time. And actually, I think he ends his book with, we live in two worlds and they're both this one. And so the idea, pardon?
I was going to say that's an interesting take on Raquel's question, because I went the route of you transfer, you miss, or the other person doesn't pick it up, but then it doesn't come back to you, it drops, and in a sense is forever lost, and you can't get out of your problem because now you don't even have the energy to push out. I mean, so it's interesting, the concept of that you put the energy out, now it's out of you, but then it gets lost, and it would seem to interfere with your wayfinding psychologically. I mean, Marilyn, thoughts on Raquel's question there with can the energy get lost?
It doesn't get lost. It just gets, like we see, pent up energy.
Yeah, unconscious.
So it can become extreme agitation. That's why sublimation is very important. If you can't do it in an open way, you can do it through art or through cooking or through some other way.
Right.
But if you just have that energy, you feel highly charged and anxious. So you need to find a way to use that energy. And it's very recommended that people will do artistic things, whatever that means to the person, to be able to utilize that energy in a positive way.
Yeah.
That makes a really big
helpful.
Yeah, it is, because you just made a really big distinction between, I often find when I use the word sublimation, people think I'm saying suppress or stuff your feelings. And it's like, no. It's exactly not that. It's honoring them, but putting them in a congruent activity that receives them, like the art or your work or your writing, so that you're utilizing them and not locking them away.
Yeah. So, for example, if people are going to celebrate Thanksgiving, what is your unique way of celebrating Thanksgiving to make it kind of artistic? Is it the cooking? Is it the way you present the food? Is it where you buy the food? And that's a way of taking the energy that you have and using it. Sublimating means taking it from being stuck inside of you, putting it out there in the world in a positive and useful way that hopefully other people will appreciate it too.
Yeah.
Like you fill the gas tank of the activity with that energy.
Yes.
It's interesting, though. It seems like Jung here is critiquing the notion of sublimation, saying, well, I don't know if that's really how Freud thinks it is, in the sense that we can just will our psychic energy towards some other thing than that which the psychic energy has already chosen. That's why I thought that line where he said the psychic energy is already possesses its object unconsciously. It's almost as if he's saying in that one line, like, well, I don't know if sublimation in the sense that we've come to talk about it is really possible.
Well, you know how I look at it, not by his words, but
Mhm.
look at his body of work.
Mhm.
This is what how much did he write? That's all sublimation. Do you agree, Skip?
Yeah, surely.
All of his whole body of work is sublimation in a sense. He's taken everything. He can't be in a room with a person, or you're saying, Skip, that he's very introverted. So what is he doing with that? He's taking all that knowledge and all that expertise, and he's putting it out there for us.
Yeah, he
And we're
left it.
benefiting
He
from
left
it.
it. Yeah, and he left it behind for us, and he knew what he had done. Okay, in other words, he had no need to have a troop of followers behind him, because he knew that once people started to discover what he had done, they were going to read his work and follow him anyway.
Mhm.
I want to just say one thing about this. This is a way when treating somebody or even being with them, it's not their words, it's what is their behavior.
Mhm.
And what
Yeah.
are they doing? That's really like they'll say, put your money where your mouth is. Well, put your observation where their behavior is.
Yeah.
Well, like Jung even said, it's not what you say you're going to do. It's what you actually do that is who you are.
I
Yeah.
agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. So Beth, do you have the book there? You want to read the last paragraph?
Before we move away from this question, could I add just one thing quickly?
Yeah, sure.
I think well, there were two points I just wanted to throw in really quickly. I think it, I guess we're getting into kind of a finer point here, so it may not be worth walking around for very long. But I think one could easily make the argument that, in terms of what Jung is saying here, it would also follow that whatever, however Jung channeled his libido into all of his work was the gradient that it chose for itself.
Absolutely.
And then Jung decided that he wanted to be a mountain climber. Like, that might not have gone very well for him.
Yeah, I agree entirely.
Yeah.
So it's not even a matter of him saying, like, I'm gonna direct this at something. It's like that was what was determined inwardly.
By
virtue of his own theory. I mean, that's what he's saying in the line that I referenced, and I think that's
he explicitly says that throughout his work. He explicitly says, I can't write anything until I'm forced to write, basically by myself. And it's the same thing that Tim says about his art. I could suggest something that he might do a work of art about, but until his muse tells him to do it, he ain't going to do it. And he knows better, right?
Right. And Nick, that's an excellent point, because also too, then we see that he consciously picked up on that was a must that he had to do. And then you get he's resonant with this thing he had no control over, of where to put it. And in that you get this just ripe success that's decades and decades long, because he's living his resonance with that which was, he's comfortable with the not knowing while daily getting things done, it seems. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah, the last thing I say, and I'll shut up. But in reply to what Raquel was asking, I think it's worth noting that the kind of end of transference, or the point of transference, is to get that transference so the energy is able to express itself. But ultimately, when you enter into that relationship with somebody, likely an analyst, the move is one of kind of slowly piercing that transference and helping the person to see like, well, I'm not really this godlike person. I'm just kind of a regular person, and I want to help you see that and slowly give it back to you. So ultimately you realize, wow, all that was within me. And you kind of take all of that libido back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it doesn't just fall back into the unconscious. It comes up and is to some degree, I suppose, sublimated or at your disposal.
And I'd say it even goes so far as to inform your further intuition, so that later when it comes up again, you turn to yourself rather than turning it on to someone else. I mean,
Yeah.
the self-knowledge can be very benefited by understanding what's yours and what's not yours. I mean, it's one of the primary forms of abuse is someone putting stuff on you. I mean, I'll say that my prime example, and I hate to say this, but dating a psychologist, you want to talk about an expert at shaming behavior. You know, you get someone who has unresolved stuff. And when you get to the point where, Jordan, if you were born 11 years earlier, this wouldn't have happened to me, you know, playing the bird with a broken wing. But, you know, how can I be responsible for traumas that were not even in the relationship, but before I was even born? So that is where you can see how toxically and how much trauma can rot the brain functions, because that wasn't a joke. And, you know, she indefatigably believes that. I mean, to a point of deep knowing and feeling that she was correct. It's one of the most out there examples I've ever seen. And unfortunately for me, you know, it indicated prison camp. You got to get out of that kind of place. But
So
anyway.
So Beth, the last paragraph here actually addresses these issues. So we probably ought to get to them.
Okay, and I just wanted to say one thing. I don't know that this is about transference or even Raquel's question, but it did make me think back to that man who retired at 45, and then his energy was going to put it towards all this other stuff, and then that didn't work, and then he couldn't even go back to his work, and you know, sort of that's what made me think of. And then they were kind of saying a case so far advanced can only be cared for until death. It can hardly be cured. So
well, I would say
that's a really good point.
I would say as to that man that the energy is always there, and he needs to keep looking for it.
True.
You know,
I like that statement you made. That's that far gone can only be cared for to death and cannot be cured. I actually asked my psychologist.
Page 52. That was
right. I actually asked my psychologist because it started as couples therapy, and then I realized he did brain spotting. She just ran out of the room. Well, after the third session, I asked him. I said, you know, you've been doing this 40 years. What chance would you have to get through to her? And he said, this will be only the second time I've ever said this. She's too far gone. So that statement on page 52, where it can only be cared for to death, that, you know, even if she worked really hard, she probably wouldn't be able to. So at that point, I realized compassion that, oh, she can't do anything about it. So they live towards death and just wish her the best in a sense that way. But that line on 52, I'm glad you brought that up, because to me that really resonates with this whole round robin here.
Thank you. Okay, 96. In the transference, all kinds of infantile fantasies are projected. They must be cauterized, i.e. resolved by reductive analysis. And this is generally known as, quote, resolving the transference, quote. Thereby the energy is again released from an unserviceable form, and again we are faced with the problem of its disposability. Once more we shall put our trust in nature, hoping that, even before it is sought, an object will have been chosen which will provide a favorable gradient.
well, I couldn't help but think of our former president and of Florence Foster Jenkins, who both of whom were rich kids. They were born with silver spoons in their mouths, and basically nobody ever said no to them. Or if they did get some sort of negative response, they would just throw a temper tantrum and then they would get away with it. And as long as you don't have any corrections from people around you, you can't cauterize your infantile fantasies.
No, that's a great point. And even with the former president, add to that the trauma of a monster of a father and a doormat of a mother. I mean, his modeling, he was doomed from the beginning.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
it's
and so the problem we have is that a lot of people are in a place where they want to project onto somebody who pretends they're a great leader, and then they get a following, and it's hard to stop. Then you get a psychic epidemic. Anyway, that's my thought. I wanted to talk about, does anybody want to speak on this last paragraph though before we move on? And then I have one other thing I want to talk about briefly.
Just add that the reductive analysis is what I was talking about, where you're just slowly reducing all of the projected elements onto oneself, saying, you say I'm this, but I'm really that, so on and so forth, until eventually they pierce through their projection or illusion of you and just see you for the human being that you are, and not as this monster or Superman.
Yeah.
exactly. And that I think goes back to Marilyn's point earlier about, some things are just too terrifying for people to face. But if you just look at it as nature has no emotions, it only has weather washes through, you can engage in weather anything, then you can actually you can amplify your courage to just, okay, what is my nature? It can't be bad if it's me. I mean, it can be terrible, it can be scary, but if it's mine, I'd like to know. And when you get into that, I think, mindset, you're right. I mean, Nick, then, again, he puts, once more, we shall put our trust in nature, and in our own nature, and understanding, oh, I'm doing that. I should not do that. That's upsetting me. It's imbalancing my life. It's causing upset in other people. And in that sense, it's not behavioral. You understand the root, and literally the behavior just goes away, because it's no longer generated. The energy is no longer generated for it. It's almost deinstalled or bled out into our work, where you literally empty it out.
Yeah, there's so many times, like in this line where he says, thereby the energy is again released from an unserviceable form. And again, we are faced with the problem of its disposability. And put our trust in nature. And it's just, there are so many times where I read something like, I understand what the words mean. I understand what it's saying, but I wish so badly I could just have a conversation with the guy and say, what the hell are you actually saying? Because it's just.
How many times have I thought that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so strange. It's almost like there's a huge contradiction in those two lines, because he says the energy is again released from an unserviceable form. So if it had an unserviceable form in the first place, the gradient which the unconscious libido already chose for itself, it chose an unserviceable form.
Yeah.
But then we're just going to put our trust back in the same process of choice that chose the unserviceable form in the first place. It's like, okay, I don't.
Well, I don't get that, Ben. I don't get that we're going to go back with the trust in nature. Once it's released from the unserviceable form, I would say ostensibly we could have learned what an unserviceable form for that energy appears like, so as to not do it again. And it's like teaching a dog or a cat. I mean, in a way, I mean, they can learn.
But in between those two lines, he says there's the problem of its disposability.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like in between
because-
A and C, he's saying with B, like, you don't have a choice, really. I mean, am I interpreting that completely incorrectly?
I don't think so, because the problem of its disposability is then, okay, you've taken it out of the unserviceable form, but you're going to carry this, uranium nuclear waste around until you can find a place to put it. I mean, the problem of then the disposability is to where do you put it? Where do you,
safely? Where do you put it
safely? Yeah, safely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
So that brings up an issue that I wanted to talk about. That's a public issue, current affairs issue. I was seeing an interview this morning with the mother of Jacob Blake Jr. Now, we may have lost track of who Jacob Blake Jr. is, but if I understand correctly, and my memory may be a little bit vague on this, Jacob Blake Jr. was shot by the police in Kenosha, Wisconsin, before all the Rittenhouse stuff. Okay, so separate from the Rittenhouse stuff that has been so in the news today. Okay, so the woman who came on, his mother, was so solid. I can't tell you how important I thought this interview was. And she was with her pastor, and she was simply saying, we just have to move on these things. And I think her son is still alive, but he's been paralyzed in some way. And she said she's a healthcare worker. She's a Black woman. And boy, she was a solid citizen. And then the pastor started to answer some questions. And he said, well, we have to get beyond the idea of criminal law and civil law, because criminal law and civil law have their rules, right? But we also have to have a law of values, and we have to refer back to God, he says. Okay, so fair enough, but that's all of Jung's work, but the point being that there are at least three structures, not two, that we ought to be thinking about. And one is a structure of values, and how can we in our society change people's values in such a way that we're not killing one another. Because the fact is, it's not going to be too long before Caucasians are going to be in the minority here, and we have to learn how to get along. And it's already the case that the world has become sort of America writ large. I mean, it just boom, it's happened in about 20 or 30 years. And so how do we get, some people who have primitive ideas to stop being in that place and, just stop and look around and see what's happening in the world? Because those methods, the methods of tribalism and boundaries and all that, that's all gone away. That's been gone for a long, long time. And I just, well, I talk about golden thread sometimes. I'm just going to show you something. But anyway, does anybody have any comment on what I've said so far? And I'm going to look
Yeah,
for
I
link.
do, and it's quite the synchronicity with the article I sent you yesterday, because what just popped back up that I didn't mention before, Nick, when you asked me about, I was telling you about that article I sent Skip, is that towards the end of it, Mirabal says, I believe it's Mirabal, says something to the effect of white people need to save the native cultures, not to be nice to the native cultures, to save their own skin, because white people think that they think with their head, and everybody here on the Pueblo knows you think with the heart. And it's interesting there's a cure for racism. In addition to, like Mark Twain said, the cure for racism is travel, learning other cultures.
Yeah, my value has always been to try to include people. And I call it having golden threads, which are invisible. They're invisible, but somehow I've developed, skeins of them. And, just to demonstrate what I'm talking about here is this is another activity of mine, which is in Kuala Lumpur. But this is the team of Anka. And notice we have just one white guy here. And yet all these other folks are other nationalities.
Said this before, but your man Ashraf looks like Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, well, Ashraf looks like Alec Baldwin, and I'm not sure. I mean, I guess, I don't know who got in the woodshed and where Ashraf is really from. I think he may be from India. But as you see here, none of my colleagues are Caucasian. I mean, this woman, Nase, is probably a Muslim of Arab descent. But, I'm sort of the token white guy in this group. But with this guy here, between me and this guy that's in the upper left corner, I've kept a golden thread for the last 18 years. And check with me next Monday where we are. But this company, which has now hired over 200, what we call in the biz freshers, people who are fresh out of school, who have their first job. We've hired over 200 people that have their first job into this company, and something is going to happen.
Yeah, there are two things that I would just lodge in as, of course, these are not,
but this comes from my values. Obviously, I'm trying to express something about my values and how I connect with people and do my best to maintain connection with people.
Yeah, the two tentative solutions not even solutions, the two things that are rattling around my head is that the optimistic side of me wants to say, I think that education, in the real sense of the word, not in the sense of just memorization of stuff and learning for tests and that kind of thing, but a real education can go a long ways for people who don't have money to go travel the world and do all of that.
Absolutely. I didn't have money to travel the world. I never went to Europe until I was 32.
There's also the part of me that remembers the thing that Heraclitus said that kind of pulls me away from idealism, which I think it was something to the effect of war is the father of all things or the father of all change. And, so there's part of me that
please understand, I'm not intending to speak about this in an idealistic way. I can promise you that I have been screwed by the best of them very seriously over almost a 50-year career now. And so, I know that, well, I would say that everybody in that group that I'm showing, is pretty solid. Okay, and one of the reasons I stuck with my partner there was because he gave his kidney to his wife when she was dying, and who would you give your kidney to, right? And he in fact gave his kidney to his wife and kept her going, and they're both thriving. And this is more than a decade ago that happened. And
yeah,
so,
I just want to make it very clear that I'm not saying that directed at anyone other than myself. I'm just saying those are the two kind of threads that I'm trying to follow in my own thinking, because I'm on board with the kind of, and I don't say it's pejoratively, but the ideal of the unification of all people and everybody dropping all their differences, but I also just think that there's something in human nature that kind of seeks to separate parts from parts. And I just think that's the nature of the game.
That's definitely true.
Well, it's interesting, Nick. I mean, dropping all the differences to me is unnatural. To me, it's learn other cultures without taking off the hard edges. Learn where not to walk to not get cut. I mean, it reminds me of the work of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who passed away about this time last year, I believe, and his work in the dignity in difference, to be unthreatened and be able to hold two ideas, whether you agree with them or not, but respectfully and compassionately. I think he may have said strong enough to be compassionate, fierce enough to be strong enough to be gentle, fierce enough to be compassionate, I think he said. And that's the quality of an unthreatened individual, that you won't go to work, they won't fight you. And you may swing, but it's like, wow, you talk a good game, but can you box? Kind of thing. And so I think the differences are actually important and crucial dynamic pieces to actually study more, to understand. And because I find the melting pot to be a cultural murder. Let's make mud out of everybody, average out the average, take the highs and the lows and make it all banal and boring. And I buy culture and learning about other cultures and supporting them rather than watering it down.
I'm not trying to have an ideal here. I'm just trying to point out that a couple of things. This pastor brought up this other gradient of values. And, Jung said that having gone out of a house, the gods will not return. So we already know, Jung knew in his time, that the gods would not return to the Christian houses of worship, because we can desperately try to hold on to that form of Christianity, but it actually has been dying for 500 years. And so what we need to find is how do values get inhabited within us and within the human species. And I do agree with the pastor that we need God back in our lives, and I think we need to understand God in a different way than how he's been understood over millennia.
I had to write a paper yesterday for a philosophy class, and it saddens me to say this a little bit, and I hope this is taken in the way that I intended, but the class has turned into a meditation on social justice, and I'm really kind of sore about it.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's just kind of deteriorated.
Yeah.
And I had to write a paper on justice, but it was like read Karl Marx Communist Manifesto and then write on what he defines justice as. And I was like, I mean, come on. Like, but
Raquel's going. the
But-
archivist is really on the move there.
but the thing that
That's
was
awesome.
helpful for me to realize in that is that I think I said something similar to what I think Skip is saying, where I was just saying, like the justice that was defined, I also had to read a piece by a philosopher, Jonathan Rawls, and he defined justice as a kind of precondition of fairness. And actually, I liked a lot of what he had to say, but it was interesting because it was like both definitions of justice took like a very humanistic way to explaining justice. I was saying that I think if you remove God from the picture, it's actually impossible to establish justice in a way that unifies everybody under one banner, because to me, it seems like you can very quickly establish kind of the lower levels of what we all agree on as justice. But ultimately, once you get to the higher level of the hierarchy, everyone is going to have a divergent idea. And you're going to
Right.
part on the
And,
most
yeah.
important thing. And it seems like it needs to be a top-down definition rather than one that's
No, I'm not convinced of that, but I do know a top person whose name is Colleen Kibert, and she came up with a different view of justice. Okay?
Well, I just want to reiterate, I don't mean top down in the sense of it being like an edict from God or anything like that. I'm just saying I think you need to establish some broad enough first principle that can encompass anything that would come below it, rather than a Christian God or the Muslim God or any such thing. Just even if it's the most abstract concept, there has to be some unifying principle at the top.
And I agree with that. And
I agree too. And even the tarot, the whole, does justice come as 8 or does strength come as 8? And is justice 11, is strength 11? And I put justice as 8 first, because it feels like there has to be justice before you can have strength, because otherwise the thing is imbalanced and it torques off and breaks. So there's a process to me of that balancing act of justice that I think aligns with some of what you're just saying, where you have to have that to then even have clarity of vision. In other words, you'll have denial or blind spots because you're
I also
missing.
just want to say it's a very fresh idea for me, and I'm not even convinced of it. It was just kind of my reaction to this what I felt to be like an overly humanistic approach to defining justice, where I was like, seems like we've got to get the first principle down. And if we can't do that, everyone's going to break apart where it really matters.
So allow me to explain a different perspective, okay?
Please.
Because after almost 50 years of being an attorney, I no longer believe in justice in the sense of the blindfolded woman with the sword and the balance, because the scales, because the system that we use to do that has been corrupted, very seriously corrupted up and down the chain, and that was obvious in Jung's time and long before Jung too. And people who talk about a whisper who dares, right? But Colleen came up, she realized she was not going to get justice. And she, over a period of years, did a series of sculptures to try to appreciate what she is looking for from this blind person or this blindfolded person. And ultimately it's not about justice, it's about truth. we want truth. And it comes down to, you know, a feather that you put on the scale of justice that, you know, it comes from Egyptian mythology, I think, where when you die, you go before this goddess and she weighs your soul, and if it gets pushed over by a feather, then she knows you're going to hell, type thing, right? Because you know, we all know how good or bad we have been, okay? And it's about the judgment day that, you know, in the end, we're going to have to face ourselves, right? And in order to know that, if you know that, then you have to analyze yourself to find out, you know, are you a good person or a bad person? And it's not a question of whether you can convince any other person in the world. It's kind of karma, right? Where if, you know, and so anyway, I just like everybody to think about values as a third rail here: criminal law, civil law, and values as sort of a third law. And how can we bring that back into society in a better way, in a convincing way, in a powerful way? And I think
I agree with that. But I'd like to add a fourth rail, that because I'd like to get us out of the Greek capital R reason philosophy of, you know, if P then Q, and too much. It's like some things make too much sense to be worth a damn.
Yeah.
And that means they're dead. And so I feel what I've been playing with lately is the definition of justice in my sandbox these days is capital N, nature. And then that just period into the story, there's the philosophy. And it's interesting to me because it starts to resonate, because nature knows no emotion. It just knows weather. It has no malice. It may destroy and create, but it's not doing things maliciously. And it's not angry, and it interacts naturally. Go figure, it's nature. But I find that's the best personal psychological model I see for how to live a life, and also then, how to mingle with.
It's an analysis we all must do, and we're all going to have to do, because the James Webb Space Telescope, knock on wood, is going to launch on December 18th. And suddenly we're going to be able to see 100 times more than we've ever seen before out into space. And so far, we've seen lots of nature, but we haven't seen another living creature. We haven't seen a microbe, on another world. And, you know, I have a dear friend who's an exobiologist. I mean, she's a biologist about outer space. And Deb asked her, you know, what would be the pinnacle of your career? And she said, to find a microbe on another world that we didn't introduce. Because I'm sure there may be microbes on the moon and on.
I was like tardigrades on the moon.
And on Mars, but you know, to find in space even a microbe that didn't have its origin here on our planet.
Well, what's the old adage? The proof of intelligent life on other planets is that they haven't visited us yet. And then there's a cartoon that goes with it, and it's the UFO flying by the Earth, and the mom turns around to the alien kids in the back. Kids, roll up your windows. This place is it's dangerous. Well, like we're all, we're like.
So anyway, Jordan, I do concur with your idea about nature and
nature
being another parameter that needs to be thought about. But I think it's worthwhile to consider how we're going to teach values if people won't come to church or to the synagogue.
Skip, I have a comment when you're finished.
Yeah, please do. Okay,
Well,
because
I
I
don't
want to
want
wrap
to
up
cut you
too.
off.
No, go ahead. I'm finished.
Okay. I think the injustices are so enormous, and I, as a woman, cannot tell you how unjust I think things are.
Mm,
I think there's a tremendous unfairness. If you're the other, which means in this country, you're not a white male. If
mhm.
you're anything but a white male, you're the other.
Yep,
And even if you are a white male, if you're not in a certain category, you're the other.
yep,
You're always at a disadvantage.
yep.
And I think until we can get past that
Mhm.
and see that each person has value, I think we're in big trouble.
Well, and so
That's really
the
resonant.
way
'Cause I
to,
used-
yeah, that's obviously true. And the way to get there, though, is to think about values. Okay, because yes, I agree with you entirely that, if you're not a white male who went to Harvard or Yale, you're not much in the political world.
That's right.
In Washington, for example, or on Wall Street, let's say. And and those people actually control the world at this point. And so, but all of us have to model values one way or another. And the problem is that, the 10 Commandments don't quite get it anymore. And,
Yeah,
sorry
let
to
me
say, yeah, go ahead.
let me just throw one thing in here quickly, and this is how I ended my paper. I kind
Okay.
of tried to sneak Jung into the conversation, even though it wasn't necessarily a deliberate reference. But I just concluded by saying, I think justice can really only be recognized and enacted by the individual.
Mm,
And I don't think
yeah,
it's really up to any kind of treatise
that's
or
right.
a list of rules or a dogma to determine
It has to be
society
it
just.
has to be enacted in each individual, and this is
Yeah,
exactly Jung's point, right?
and I also asked the question in the paper, which I mean, it was kind of a rhetorical question, although I would love to have some conversation around it in my class. But I was asking, does that also mean that we're waiting around on just laws to decide that we want to be just ourselves, and that if we
Mm,
don't have just laws, that we can't be just ourselves?
Right.
That's an issue.
But
yeah,
the thing
that's a
also,
great question.
the thing also that I wanted to add to that, which is I think just supplements what Marilyn was saying, and this is something that I oddly came up in a friend of mine's dream that we were talking about. But we were talking about this dream, and a friend of mine was getting a bunch of stuff tattooed on themselves.
Mhm.
And it was kind of like, it seemed to me like it had something about values. And I was like, it's interesting, like, if we think about defining our own values, it almost seems like there's something in the dream about a call to define your own values. And that led me to think about how, often we kind of ride along on the cultural norms and values, and we don't really precisely define what our values are. And we just assume like we're good people, we're.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a good idea to define what our values are.
Well, I don't
Okay,
mean like as a collective, I mean individually. And I agree with you that the 10 Commandments, as an example, might not be that kind of unifying thing anymore. But I think each person defining their own 10 Commandments would probably
that would be useful. Okay, so let's wrap it up with the last thing that one of the last things that Jung wrote, which was his essay. I think it's the last thing he wrote, 10 days before his death, which is the first quarter of Man and His Symbols, the book Man and His Symbols. And in that in this book, which I happen to have a hard copy of, and if you can ever get yourself a hard copy of it, you should do that, because unfortunately the paperback doesn't have all the prints, and they're not color, and it makes a difference to have the color prints. But there's one paragraph that he writes that is really important, and we all have to think about it. He says, as any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself or herself whether by chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do that, to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with the powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs to face the present condition of the world. And so I'm going to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Marilyn, do you want to comment? You had a very serious expression on your face. Did you want
No,
to comment?
I just think it's very important to have conversations like this
Yeah,
and to be aware of what you're thinking and then to make it happen.
right.
Even if nobody else in the world agrees with you, do your vision.
Right.
And I want to thank you, Skip, for all the work that you're doing. I know you're following some vision someplace.
Well, I
But
do
I
have
think
a
all
vision.
of us who are here
Right.
are following a vision of some kind. Follow your dream.
Exactly. Yeah,
And I
I mean,
love your question, Nick, because I had an honors poli sci professor. He said, before we start reading all these books in political science, everybody leave, come back on Wednesday, and I want you to have your own personal Bill of Rights written. And then we will have to respect each other, and then you won't be so influenced by these quote unquote God's last names, not damn it, books. So
and by the way, that's all logos.
Yeah.
So I argue that everything that's logos is dead. And we have to learn to live in the eros, because that's where we do live. That's where life is. And if we are committed to logos all the time, then we're never going to get there. And so, if I found anything, and including in the Indian thing we were talking about, Jordan, was that, Mountain Lake, Mirabal, said that the Pueblos think from the heart, not from the head.
Right.
And obviously he was pointing to this fact that we have to live more in the heart. And so my original mission, Marilyn, very simply was that I was starting to freak out when I'd been reading Jung for about 10 years. And I said, where are the messages to current affairs, to public life? Because, it's all well and good to do analyses of people. And, that's a onesie every time. And so you get somebody who can do something, right? Theoretically, you, as the rabbi said, you get life and you get it in abundance. But I said, where are people talking about, public life where we have 7.5 billion people on the planet, and the approach of the Jungian analysts, it's fine as a profession, but there's so much here in what Jung said that it needs to get projected more out into the public so that people can experience it for themselves. And that's what I've been trying to do basically for 11 years now. So,
well, and that thinking with the heart piece too, I haven't found a corroborated source to vet the article, but I saw an article last week that there was a discovery that they found 40,000 brain cells in the human heart.
yes, that was an interesting insight.
Yeah, and then that I want to find a corroborating source to vet it, but at the same time, it doesn't feel wrong. I mean,
It doesn't feel wrong. It doesn't feel wrong. And so it's something to think about because, as I often say, look around you, everything that is not a human being or an animal or a potted plant is dead. None of it is alive. Now we need the logos to produce that, from this book to this bracelet of mine, logos has to be 100% to produce any of these solid things that we have in our room, because we picked them all. We all picked the things that are in our room, right? For some reason. And we wouldn't have done that if logos hadn't made them perfect for the purpose. But the point is, it's not alive. And so how do we get ourselves back in our body so that we are thinking about the future? That's the, and it's all well and good to be a scientist who disdains arrows, but there's no life in that.
Yeah.
In the end.
It's like the home is a stationary orbit cemetery. I mean, I find it important in my life to every once in a while, just for the sake of it, move things around.
Yeah.
Because you then naturally walk through a different perspective. You can't not have. And so to me, I laugh. Someone calls it OCD, and I'm like, no. That's called a Ranger syndrome. It's about aesthetics.
So I've got to get out of here. I'm an hour late getting back to Deb, and so
happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
So
Yes.
we'll be doing the next chapter next Monday. I'll be back on station on Monday, and so it'll be chapter 5 of 2 essays in analytical psychology that we'll be talking about. Okay, Nick?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be here. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Okay.
Be safe if you're traveling, and I'll see you all next week.
Yeah, so I'm not going to blow off a meeting of this group because of Thanksgiving. I'm not promising for Christmas and New Year's, but because I haven't looked for the dates yet, and I don't know about Hanukkah and other holidays, right? But anyway, for Thanksgiving, we're going to keep going. But the advanced reading group will not have a class this Wednesday. And the main reason for that is I'm not going to be sitting at this workstation, and I have to do that in order to run the class. So there will be a class a week from Wednesday, but not this Wednesday. So peace, everyone. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
And Raquel, you need to institute Thanksgiving
In Brazil.
in Brazil. Well, the reason is it's our one holiday that is not associated with any specific religion. It's a family holiday, and it's a holiday in which we give thanks for our lives and for all the blessings that we have, whether we do it through religion or whatever. But it's a family holiday, and to me, it's our most important holiday because it doesn't exclude anybody, right?
Have you seen
Well-
the cartoon with the Pilgrim and the Native American though?
Yeah.
Where they're standing there and the Native American says, "Okay, let me see if I got this straight. First, you arrive here illegally, and now you want us to teach you about corn?"
What were you going to say, Raquel?
Sorry, yeah.
Brazil has carnival at least, so
Oh, that's even
it's
better.
not right now.
Mhm.
It's in February, but we
Okay.
have that. It's kind of like
Well,
that.
Nice.
Yeah,
It's
but
just a
it-
big party. It's
It
kind
is
of
a big
different.
party, yeah. But it is affiliated with the Christian church, is it not? Because it's at the time of the advent of Lent or the beginning of Lent, correct?
Yeah, it is.
But doesn't it? It puts New Orleans to shame, I think.
Oh yeah, surely it does that. It's a big
Yeah.
party. Obviously, you need big parties, but this is so nobody is excluded, right? Nobody, and so anyway, for me, it's an important holiday.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna go meet my granddaughter after 2 years because she was born in January of
Oh my God,
two
that's
years
awesome.
ago, and we've
That
never
is
met.
wonderful.
Cool.
Oh, good luck. Good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope I don't scare her with my caterpillar.
That's
All right.